So there is no guarantee to the right to vote in the U.S. Constitution. So our first major legislation to remedy discrimination against particular groups, particularly African Americans, comes in the Voting Rights Act, passed in 1965. And for a very long time, a lot of efforts were made to open up and increase voting among underrepresented groups. But over time, at the same time, the Republicans started to lose elections they thought they should be winning to Democrats with the empowerment, particularly of African American voters. So starting around 2000 with the election of George W. Bush, the Republicans start a concerted effort to restrict voting access. That culminates in 2013 with the Supreme Court decision in Shelby v. Holder, which removes southern states from the jurisdiction of the U.S. Justice Department. So that means they can pass any kind of voter law, and it doesn't have to be approved by the federal government. It can just stand. That was a huge, huge turn of events in the history of voting rights in the United States. The election of Barack Obama in 2008 saw parity, equal levels of turnout, in fact, slightly higher levels of turnout among African American voters than white voters. First time in history that happened. These were warning signs to the Republicans that if they didn't try to restrict voting somehow, they were going to start to lose a lot more elections because of increased turnout among groups that had been discriminated against in the past. So the Republicans had to ramp up their game and start restricting polling places, polling times, drop box. This coincided with the Trump election of 2016.
We wanted to study the changes in election laws after the 2020 election because former President Donald Trump made claims that the election was stolen. He made claims that elections were not secure and that there was rampant voter fraud. We've been studying the states of Arizona, Georgia, Florida, Texas, and Rhode Island. Rhode Island being one of the states that some election law experts say expanded access to the ballot.
Since the Rhode Island Vote Act was passed in 2022, the increase in access to voting through mail-in ballots has given the people the opportunity to omit that cost that they would have incurred had that not been the case, and they would have had to get their own transportation, whether that be taking the bus or paying for an Uber to go vote.
A lot of the states, actually, 4 of the states we're studying, have seen their cost of voting index increase. There are many more requirements and many more hoops and loops people have to jump through just to cast their ballots.
The cost of voting in Texas has increased over the past few years because of voting regulations that, one, make it harder to turn in your ballot in the first place, and 2, how you can get to a polling location.
There was decreased turnout. You saw drops of anywhere from 8 to 11% after new restrictions were put in place on voting.
Over 2 million Georgians have significantly increased travel times to ballot drop box locations. They're also only open from 9 to 5, so people who have jobs during normal business hours would have to take off work to drop off their ballots.
It's become significantly harder to get to a polling location in a timely manner.
So you can see it's strategic. The kinds of things they do, limiting polling hours, eliminating early voting, particularly Sundays when African Americans typically mobilize and vote early after church, for example, those are targeted.
I think that some of the laws that have been passed in Arizona since 2020 have been designed, at least ostensibly, to reduce voter fraud. But in practice, if you're removing voters from voting lists or if they need to provide new forms of documentation, or if they're no longer receiving early ballots, all of those types of changes make it a bit more difficult to vote, and that can deter people from casting a ballot.
The cost of voting has definitely increased in Florida due to the laws Senate Bill 90 and Senate Bill 524. We've seen that these bills have created generally a fear around people voting who aren't sure whether they can legally vote or not. There's fear of increasing fines. There's fear that people will be arrested for making mistakes in their registration, in their ballots. Arguably, Florida has gone even further than many other states in restricting the right to vote.
All of these added difficulties or costs in the voting process along every step make it difficult, especially for the most vulnerable populations, to exercise their right to vote.
The Voting Rights Project at the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy at the Watson Institute is designed to encourage young people to do the research, do the legwork, engage in advocacy to ensure voting rights for all people in America. We're grateful that this has been supported by Brown University and some very generous alumni donors who believe in the cause.